Transylvania. When you hear that name, your mind probably jumps to vampires and Gothic castles. But this was actually America's almost 14th colony, and it came surprisingly close to reshaping our entire map. Right now, as you're watching this in 2025, there are territories and regions across America that nearly became the 51st, 52nd, or even 53rd state. Some had nearly 1 million residents, others had congressional approval, and a few were just one signature away from statehood. These stories still resonate in 2025 as America grapples with deep political divides between regions and their distant state capitals. We are counting down 12 proposed states that almost joined the Union and revealing what happened to these forgotten territories in our modern era. Transylvania, from colonial dreams to modern Kentucky. Number 12, Transylvania, first proposed in 1775. The mastermind behind this colonial scheme was Richard Henderson, a former North Carolina judge who abandoned his comfortable courtroom career in 1773 to chase fortune in land speculation. Henderson formed the Transylvania Company with several business partners, all convinced they could carve out their own piece of American territory before the Revolutionary War changed everything. Their target was the vast wilderness beyond the Appalachian Mountains, where few European settlers had ventured, but Cherokee tribes had lived for generations. Henderson's plan hinged on a single day, March 17, 1775. At Sycamore Shoals in present-day Tennessee, Henderson orchestrated what he called a legitimate land purchase from the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee leaders who signed the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals handed over about 17 million acres of territory in exchange for goods worth about 10,000 pounds, muskets, ammunition, clothing, and other trade items. Henderson walked away believing he owned more land than some European countries. But the deal was rotten from the start. Cherokee chief Dragging Canoe warned Henderson that the land was dark and bloody ground and predicted violence would follow any attempt at settlement. Many Cherokee leaders refused to recognize the treaty, claiming the signatories had no authority to sell ancestral lands. The British Crown immediately declared the purchase illegal under the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited private land deals with native tribes. Virginia and North Carolina were even more hostile, insisting the territory already belonged to them under their original colonial charters. Henderson ignored these objections and pressed forward. He established the town of Boonesborough and created a colonial government complete with elected representatives and written laws. For a brief moment in 1775, Transylvania functioned as an independent colony with its own legislature and judicial system. Henderson even petitioned the Continental Congress for recognition as the 14th American colony, arguing that Transylvania deserved the same status as Pennsylvania or Virginia. The Continental Congress crushed Henderson's dreams without ceremony. In 1778, they rejected Transylvania's petition outright, refusing to even consider it as a legitimate colonial entity. Virginia's powerful delegation made it clear that recognizing Henderson's land grab would set a dangerous precedent for private companies creating their own territories. The Revolutionary War then sealed Transylvania's fate as political priorities shifted to fighting Britain rather than sorting out competing territorial claims. By 1776, Henderson's colonial experiment was collapsing. Virginia began issuing its own land grants in Kentucky, ignoring Henderson's claims entirely. North Carolina did the same in Tennessee. Without legal recognition from Congress or support from existing colonies, Henderson had no way to enforce his territorial boundaries or govern the growing number of settlers flooding into the region. The Transylvania Company dissolved in legal challenges and financial ruin, leaving Henderson personally bankrupt and politically irrelevant. The failure of Henderson's speculative venture paved the way for what actually happened to this territory. Western Kentucky, where Henderson dreamed of establishing his capital, now houses over 1.2 million residents across major cities like Louisville, Bowling Green, and Owensboro. Northern Tennessee, the other half of proposed Transylvania, is home to more than 800,000 people in cities like Knoxville and Nashville's expanding metropolitan area. These aren't struggling frontier settlements, they're thriving economic centers that Henderson could never have imagined. Modern political movements to reunite these historical Transylvania territories are essentially non-existent. Kentucky and Tennessee have developed distinct political cultures and economic interests over 250 years of separate statehood. Kentucky leans Republican in presidential elections but maintains Democratic traditions in state politics, while Tennessee has become solidly Republican across all levels of government. The idea of combining these regions into a single political entity has no contemporary support or practical justification. Henderson's Transylvania represents one of history's most spectacular examples of failed speculation, creating unexpected success. His colonial dreams collapsed in legal challenges and political opposition, but that failure allowed these territories to develop into two of America's most culturally distinctive regions. Kentucky became synonymous with bourbon, horses, and coal, while Tennessee created Nashville's music empire and Smoky Mountain tourism. Henderson's broken colonial vision ultimately produced something far more valuable than anything his Transylvania company could have built. But Henderson's naming strategy was at least creative compared to what came next. Some proposed states took a much more straightforward approach to choosing their identity. Delm Marva, the peninsula that almost became America's Delaware Plus. Number 11, Delm Marva, first proposed in 1776. The Delm Marva Peninsula demonstrates exactly how residents felt when carved up between three different states. Delaware claims the northern section, Maryland controls the middle portion, and Virginia owns the southern tip. This 180-mile strip of land jutting out from Maryland's eastern coast created awkward political divisions that frustrated residents since colonial times, generating perfect conditions for statehood movements whenever peninsula dwellers felt ignored by their distant state capitals. The first serious push for peninsula independence came just months after America declared independence from Britain. In November 1776, while Maryland's founding fathers were busy drafting their Declaration of Rights, Peninsula delegates attempted a political sleight of hand that nearly worked. They quietly tried to slip a secession clause into Maryland's founding documents that would allow regions to break away from the state whenever they wanted. The language was deliberately vague and buried in technical legal text, designed to fly under the radar of mainland delegates who weren't paying close attention to the fine print. But mainland Maryland politicians weren't as distracted as peninsula delegates hoped. They spotted the secession language and killed it immediately, recognizing that allowing any region to leave at will would doom Maryland's political unity before it even got started. The peninsula delegates had overplayed their hand, revealing their separatist intentions too early in the process. Their failure taught future statehood advocates that subtlety and patience would be essential for any successful independence movement. The lesson paid off 57 years later when peninsula politicians tried a completely different approach. Instead of creating a brand new state, Delaware lawmakers proposed simply absorbing Maryland's eastern shore into their existing territory in 1833. This annexation strategy seemed far more realistic than demanding Congress create an entirely new state from scratch. Delaware already had statehood, established government institutions, and representation in Congress. Adding Maryland's eastern shore would just expand Delaware's boundaries rather than requiring complex constitutional procedures for admitting new states. The annexation proposal gained momentum with shocking speed. The Delaware legislature passed the resolution through both chambers without significant opposition. Delaware politicians saw clear benefits in expanding their tiny state's territory and population base. The proposal then crossed state lines and somehow passed the Maryland House of Delegates, despite representing a direct loss of Maryland territory and tax revenue. Everything came down to the Maryland Senate, where Eastern Shore annexation faced its final political test. Peninsula residents watched nervously as Maryland senators debated whether to voluntarily surrender a chunk of their state to Delaware. The Eastern Shore delegation argued passionately that geographic separation from mainland Maryland created insurmountable governance problems. They pointed to poor roads, unreliable ferry service, and communication delays that left Peninsula residents feeling politically abandoned. But the Maryland Senate ultimately refused to dismember their state. The annexation proposal died by a narrow margin, crushing what had been the closest any Delm Marva statehood movement would ever come to success. Peninsula residents had passed through 3 separate legislative chambers and needed just one more vote to fundamentally reshape the mid-Atlantic political map. The failure of 1833 annexation didn't kill Peninsula independence dreams permanently. In 1992, frustrated residents formed the Delm Marva State Party to revive statehood arguments for the modern era. Party organizers pointed out that the peninsula's population had reached roughly 750,000 people, which exceeded South Dakota's population and qualified for statehood under any reasonable demographic standard. They projected peninsula growth to 922,000 residents within a few decades, creating an even stronger case for independent statehood. The 1992 movement emphasized economic and political arguments that resonated with contemporary peninsula concerns. Advocates argued that 3-state political division created unnecessary bureaucratic complexity and prevented coordinated regional economic development. They pointed to successful peninsula-wide cooperation on environmental issues like Chesapeake Bay restoration as evidence that the region already functioned as a single economic and ecological unit. But the Delm Marva State Party failed to generate the political momentum needed for serious statehood consideration. The movement gradually faded from public attention as founders aged out of activism and younger residents showed little interest in continuing the independence campaign. By 2000, organized peninsula statehood advocacy had essentially disappeared. Today's Delm Marva Peninsula houses around 1 million residents spread across its 3-state political structure. The peninsula's modern political dynamics reflect what could be called Brexit-style regional politics, where geographic identity competes with state-level party loyalty. Peninsula voters often share more common interests with each other than with their respective state capitals. Peninsula agriculture and maritime industries generate approximately $38 billion annually across all 3 state boundaries. Chicken farming dominates the agricultural economy, with companies like Purdue and Tyson operating massive processing facilities throughout the region. Commercial fishing, crab harvesting, and oyster farming create additional maritime economic activity that treats the peninsula as a single economic unit regardless of state political boundaries. Modern transportation and communication infrastructure has largely eliminated the geographic isolation that originally drove statehood movements. These modern connections make statehood less necessary for addressing peninsula residents' practical concerns, while potentially making independence more economically viable than ever before. But not every statehood movement faced such civilized political opposition. Some state governments responded to independence talk with threats that would make modern politicians blush. Westia, when Pennsylvania threatened death for statehood dreams. Number 10. Westia, first proposed in 1776. Pennsylvania's colonial government demonstrated exactly how far established authorities would go to crush independence movements. When Western settlers began organizing for statehood, the response wasn't negotiation or compromise. It was legislation, making secession advocacy punishable by death. This brutal crackdown instantly ended what could have become America's most successful early independence movement. The Westia proposal emerged from the geographic reality of 1770s Pennsylvania. The colony stretched from the Delaware River in the east all the way to the Ohio River in the west, creating a massive territory that was nearly impossible to govern effectively. Philadelphia sat comfortably on the Atlantic coast, connected to European trade networks and colonial political centers. But Western Pennsylvania existed in a different world entirely, a frontier wilderness where settlers faced constant threats from Native American raids, British allied forces, and the simple challenge of surviving in unsettled territory. These Western settlers weren't just geographically isolated from Philadelphia's government. They were politically abandoned. The colonial assembly was dominated by Eastern merchants and landowners who had little understanding of frontier conditions and even less interest in spending money to address Western problems. When frontier families begged for military protection against Native American attacks, Philadelphia politicians either ignored their requests or sent token forces that arrived too late to help. When settlers needed roads to transport crops to eastern markets, the assembly prioritized harbor improvements and urban infrastructure instead. The frustration reached a breaking point in the early 1770s as frontier violence escalated and Philadelphia's neglect became impossible to ignore. Western Pennsylvania settlers began holding informal meetings to discuss their grievances and explore options for political independence. These weren't radicals or troublemakers. They were farmers, merchants, and community leaders who had exhausted every legal avenue for getting attention from colonial authorities. Their discussions grew more serious as it became clear that Philadelphia would never prioritize Western interests over Eastern political concerns. By 1776, Western Pennsylvania residents were openly discussing secession and statehood, building on earlier 1775 petitions that had been rebranded as the Westlvania movement. They proposed creating a new colony that would stretch from Western Pennsylvania through parts of what would later become West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. The proposed boundaries followed natural geographic lines along the Appalachian Mountains and Ohio River, creating a territory that made far more sense politically and economically than Pennsylvania's unwieldy east-west expanse. The Westlvania movement gained momentum as the American Revolution began and colonial governments faced unprecedented challenges to their authority. Western settlers argued that if the American colonies could declare independence from Britain over taxation and representation issues, then Western Pennsylvania could certainly declare independence from Philadelphia over the same principles. They weren't being represented in colonial decision-making, and they were definitely being taxed to support government services they never received. Pennsylvania's response was swift, decisive, and terrifying. Rather than negotiating with Western representatives or addressing their legitimate grievances, the Colonial Assembly passed legislation in 1776, making advocacy for Westlvania statehood an act of treason punishable by death. Anyone caught promoting secession, organizing independence meetings, or even discussing the possibility of creating a separate Western colony could face execution as a traitor to Pennsylvania. This wasn't an empty threat designed to scare off casual dissidents. Pennsylvania authorities began investigating suspected Westlvania supporters and issuing arrest warrants for prominent Western leaders who had participated in independence discussions. The message was unmistakable. Philadelphia would rather execute its own citizens than lose control over Western territory and the tax revenue it generated. The death penalty threat worked exactly as Pennsylvania intended. Western settlers who had been willing to risk their lives fighting British forces or Native American raids weren't prepared to face execution by their own colonial government. The Westlvania movement collapsed almost overnight as organizers fled the territory, stopped attending meetings, or publicly renounced their independence sympathies. The territories that would have comprised Westlvania now house over 2.3 million people across parts of West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, and eastern Kentucky. These modern populations live in areas that still struggle with the same basic problem that drove the original movement: political and economic isolation from their state capitals. Coal industry decline has devastated local economies throughout the region, eliminating thousands of jobs and leaving entire communities economically stranded. The opioid crisis has further weakened these areas, creating workforce shortages and social problems that state governments seem unable to address effectively. Political voting patterns in these regions reflect the continued geographic and cultural divide that Pennsylvania's death threats temporarily suppressed. West Virginia has become solidly Republican with a CPVI of R+19, while western Pennsylvania counties also vote Republican in presidential elections, often by margins that contrast sharply with statewide results. The same forces that created the Westlvania independence movement in 1776 remain active across this territory in 2025, proving that Pennsylvania's threats of execution only delayed rather than resolved the fundamental problems. But sometimes, statehood movements came much closer to success than anyone expected. Franklin, the state that lost statehood by 2 votes. Number 9. Franklin, first proposed in 1784. Just 2 votes. That's all that stood between Franklin and becoming America's 14th state. Out of the dozens of failed statehood proposals throughout American history, none came closer to success than Franklin. The margin was so narrow that individual congressmen could have changed the entire course of American geography just by switching their position on a single vote. The Franklin story begins with one of the seediest political scandals of the early American Republic. North Carolina's political elite had discovered a lucrative scheme. They sold vast tracts of Western territory to political insiders at heavily discounted prices, knowing these well-connected buyers could flip the land to incoming settlers for massive profits. When settlers started comparing notes and discovered they had been systematically cheated by the very government officials who were supposed to serve their interests, the anger was immediate and explosive. Western settlers began organizing resistance to North Carolina's authority in 1784, proposing that all territory west of the Appalachian Mountains should secede and form an independent state called Franklin. The name honored Benjamin Franklin, whose reputation for integrity provided a sharp contrast to the corruption they were fleeing. Franklin would encompass roughly what is now eastern Tennessee, creating a territory large enough and populous enough to qualify for immediate statehood under federal guidelines. The Franklin independence movement gained momentum with remarkable speed. Settlers elected their own governor, established a functioning legislature, and began operating as an independent political entity while they pursued formal recognition from Congress. For nearly 4 years, Franklin functioned as a de facto independent state with its own laws, tax system, and government operations. They even negotiated treaties with Cherokee tribes and established diplomatic relations with Spanish authorities in nearby territories. Franklin's leaders submitted a formal statehood petition to Congress in 1785, confident they had built a strong case for independence. The territory met all the standard requirements for statehood's sufficient population, organized government, defined boundaries, and the ability to contribute to national defense and economic development. Franklin's representatives argued passionately that their territory deserved recognition as much as any existing state, and that continued subjugation to North Carolina's corrupt political system violated basic principles of representative government. The congressional vote on Franklin's statehood created intense drama as representatives from existing states wrestled with the precedent they would set by admitting a territory that had essentially seceded from an existing state. Some congressmen worried that recognizing Franklin would encourage other regions to pursue similar independence movements, potentially fragmenting existing states and destabilizing the young nation's political structure. Others argued that Franklin's case was unique because of the documented corruption that had driven their independence movement. When the final vote was counted, Franklin had fallen just 2 votes short of the 2/3 majority required for statehood admission. The margin was heartbreakingly close, so narrow that a few congressmen changing their minds could have completely altered American political geography. Franklin's representatives watched in stunned silence as their years of preparation and organization collapsed over a mathematical technicality that represented less than 5% of the total congressional membership. The federal rejection left Franklin with no viable options for maintaining independence. Without congressional recognition, they couldn't establish formal diplomatic relations with other states or foreign governments. They couldn't access federal funding for infrastructure development or military protection. Most importantly, they couldn't prevent North Carolina from reasserting political control over the territory whenever it chose to do so. North Carolina moved quickly to reintegrate Franklin territory before another independence movement could develop. The state offered amnesty to Franklin leaders who had technically committed treason by establishing an independent government, while also implementing some reforms to address the corruption issues that had sparked the original secession. By 1788, Franklin had been fully absorbed back into North Carolina, and the territory remained under North Carolina control until Tennessee achieved statehood in 1796. The region that would have comprised Franklin now contains about 2 million residents throughout eastern Tennessee. The economic transformation from frontier agriculture to modern diversified economy reflects Tennessee's broader development into one of America's fastest-growing states. Franklin's failure ultimately led to absorption into what became one of America's most economically dynamic states, proving that sometimes political rejection creates better long-term outcomes than independence would have achieved. But Franklin's modest territorial ambitions pale in comparison to what some religious groups had in mind for reshaping America's map. Some proposed states weren't just seeking independence, they were planning to create empires that would stretch across multiple time zones. Deseret, the Mormon empire that would have stretched ocean to ocean. Number 8. Deseret, first proposed in 1849. The proposed state of Deseret would have covered over 500,000 square miles, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Rocky Mountains and encompassing more territory than most European countries combined. This wasn't just another regional statehood proposal. It was an audacious plan to create America's largest state while establishing the first explicitly religious government in United States history. The Mormon settlers who proposed Deseret weren't casual pioneers looking for better farmland. They were religious refugees fleeing systematic persecution that had followed them across multiple states and cost their prophet Joseph Smith his life. Missouri had expelled them through official government order. Illinois mobs had burned their settlements and murdered their leaders. By 1847, when Brigham Young led the Mormon exodus to the Salt Lake Valley, they were desperate to find a place where they could practice their religion without facing violence or legal harassment from hostile neighbors. The Mexican-American War provided the perfect opportunity for Mormon territorial ambitions. When the United States acquired vast western territories through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the federal government suddenly controlled millions of acres of largely unsettled land that needed organized territorial governments. Mormon leaders recognized that they could petition for statehood in this newly acquired territory before competing groups had time to establish competing claims or political organizations. Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders moved quickly to capitalize on this window of opportunity. In 1849, they organized a constitutional convention in Salt Lake City that brought together representatives from Mormon settlements scattered across the Western territories. The delegates faced the challenging task of creating a government structure that would protect Mormon religious practices while appearing legitimate and acceptable to federal authorities who had shown little sympathy for Mormon political aspirations in other states. The constitution they produced surprised everyone with its progressive and inclusive language. Rather than creating the theocratic government that critics expected, Mormon delegates drafted a document that explicitly guaranteed freedom of religion for all residents, not just members of their faith. The Constitution included clear separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial branches, modeled after Iowa's Constitution, which was considered one of the most democratic state constitutions of the era. They included civil rights protections that extended to all residents regardless of their religious beliefs or ethnic backgrounds. Mormon leaders justified these expansive boundaries by arguing that they needed sufficient territory to accommodate their rapidly growing population and establish economically viable settlements in the challenging Western environment. They pointed out that much of the proposed territory was still unsettled or sparsely populated, meaning Deseret statehood wouldn't displace existing political communities or established territorial governments. They also emphasized their proven ability to create successful agricultural settlements in difficult terrain, citing the rapid development of Salt Lake Valley as evidence of their colonization capabilities. Southern senators voted to block Deseret in 1850, fearful of adding such a large free state. Congressional prejudice against Mormon religious practices added another layer of opposition to Deseret statehood. Many federal politicians viewed Mormonism as a dangerous cult rather than a legitimate Christian denomination, and they expressed deep concern about allowing Mormon leaders to control such a vast territory with minimal federal oversight. Stories about Mormon polygamy, communal economic practices, and alleged theocratic governance fueled congressional suspicions about Mormon political loyalty and democratic commitment. In 1851, Congress rejected the Mormon proposal and instead created Utah Territory with much smaller boundaries and a federally appointed territorial governor. The Mormons petitioned again in 1856 and 1862, but these efforts were unsuccessful as federal opposition remained firm. The territories that would have comprised Deseret now house over 28 million people across 6 different states. The combined economic output of these regions generates over $2.1 trillion annually through technology industries, entertainment production, mining operations, agricultural production, and tourism industries that draw millions of visitors to national parks and recreational areas throughout the region. Modern Mormon influence across these territories remains significant but varies dramatically by location. Utah maintains a Mormon majority with about 60% of residents belonging to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Nevada, Arizona, and California have substantial Mormon minorities but no Mormon political majorities. The Church's economic and cultural influence extends throughout these areas through business networks, educational institutions, and charitable organizations that trace their origins to the original Mormon settlement patterns. Deseret's rejection ultimately created multiple states that collectively wield far more political and economic power than one megastate could have achieved. But while Mormon leaders chose a unique religious name for their proposed territory, other statehood movements took a much more predictable approach to naming their independence dreams. Jefferson, the most popular failed state name in American history. Number 7. Jefferson, first proposed in 1859. Thomas Jefferson's name has been attached to more failed statehood proposals than any other presidential moniker in American history. 4 separate regions across 4 different time periods have tried to honor the 3rd president by naming their proposed states after him. Each movement drew inspiration from Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration of Independence and his lifelong championship of local democracy and individual liberty, principles these regions claimed their distant state governments were denying them. The first Jefferson proposal emerged in 1859 in the Rocky Mountain territories during the Colorado Gold Rush. Miners and settlers flooding into the region found themselves in a legal and political vacuum with no effective territorial government to maintain order or resolve disputes. The Kansas territorial government technically controlled the area, but Kansas was hundreds of miles away and had no practical ability to govern mining camps scattered throughout the mountains. Rocky Mountain residents organized their own elections, established courts, and began operating as an independent political entity while pursuing federal recognition. The Kansas government initially supported their efforts, even granting preliminary approval for the miners to define their own territorial boundaries. but the Jefferson Territory collapsed from internal disagreements before achieving federal recognition. Residents couldn't agree on basic constitutional questions about voting rights, taxation, and the territorial capital's location. By 1861, federal authorities had resolved the confusion by creating Colorado Territory instead. Texas produced two separate Jefferson proposals that attempted to carve new states from different parts of the massive territory. The 1870 proposal targeted southeastern Texas, where residents felt politically dominated by state government officials who prioritized central and northern Texas interests over Gulf Coast concerns. The proposed Jefferson state would have included Houston, Galveston, and other coastal cities that generated significant state revenue through maritime commerce and port activities. The southeastern Texas Jefferson movement argued that their region's economic contributions to state government far exceeded the public investment they received in return. They pointed to inadequate infrastructure development, limited educational funding, and poor transportation networks as evidence of state neglect. The proposal gained some legislative support, but never achieved serious momentum. The 1915 Texas Jefferson proposal shifted to western Texas, where ranchers and farmers felt equally ignored by state governments centered in Austin. Western Texas residents faced different challenges: drought, isolation, and limited market access, but shared the same frustration with distant state authority that seemed unresponsive to regional needs. The 1915 proposal attracted support from only 6 state senators, demonstrating the difficulty of building statehood coalitions even in a state with strong independence traditions. The final and most dramatic Jefferson proposal emerged in 1941 across the Pacific Northwest, encompassing Northern California and Southern Oregon. This Jefferson movement went far beyond legislative petitions. Organizers staged armed marches, distributed secessionist flyers, and established a provisional government complete with elected officials and a state seal. Supporters argued that Sacramento and Salem ignored their rural concerns while imposing urban-oriented policies that damaged their agricultural and timber economies. The 1941 Jefferson movement gained serious momentum through grassroots organizing and media attention that brought national awareness to their independence campaign. They scheduled a formal secession ceremony and began making practical preparations for establishing an independent state government. The movement had attracted thousands of supporters and seemed positioned to force a political crisis requiring federal intervention. Pearl Harbor destroyed the Pacific Northwest Jefferson movement overnight. The Japanese attack on December 7, 1941, instantly transformed American political priorities from regional grievances to national survival. Jefferson organizers immediately suspended their independence campaign and redirected their energy towards supporting the war effort. The attack had created national unity that made regional secession movements seem unpatriotic during a time of national crisis. The 4 Jefferson territories now house dramatically different populations and political cultures in 2025. Colorado contains approximately 5.8 million residents and has evolved into a purple state with competitive elections and diverse political representation. The state's economy has diversified beyond mining into technology, aerospace, and renewable energy industries. Texas regions that propose Jefferson statehood now hold roughly 3.2 million people across southeastern and western areas that remain politically conservative but economically integrated with the broader state. The Texas nationalist movement continues advocating for complete independence, with the Republican Party of Texas including an independence referendum call in its 2024 platform. Northern California and Southern Oregon territories that comprised the 1941 Jefferson proposal now contain about 1.4 million residents living in predominantly rural areas that remain politically isolated from their state capitals. These regions continue voting Republican in presidential elections while their states support Democratic candidates, reflecting the same urban-rural political divide that originally motivated their secession movement. The Jefferson name's repeated appearance reveals how certain geographic areas consistently feel politically isolated from their state capitals, regardless of specific policy issues or historical circumstances. But while these Jefferson movements shared common grievances about distant government control, some statehood proposals emerged from completely opposite political motivations. Nicerjack, the Confederate state that wanted to stay Union. Number 6. Nicerjack, first proposed in 1861. While the rest of the South rushed to join the Confederacy, the proposed state of Nicerjack desperately tried to stay with the Union. This collection of counties in northern Alabama and eastern Tennessee refused to abandon the United States government even as their neighbors embraced secession and slavery-based rebellion, creating one of the Civil War era's most fascinating political paradoxes. The Nicerjack territory encompassed counties where the landscape itself had shaped a completely different economic and social structure from the plantation-dominated lowlands. These areas made large-scale cotton farming nearly impossible, which meant that the slave-based agricultural economy that dominated most of the South had never taken root in these communities. Instead of massive plantations worked by hundreds of enslaved people, Nicerjack residents operated small family farms that relied on their own labor rather than slave ownership. This economic difference created a fundamental political divide that grew more pronounced as sectional tensions escalated throughout the 1850s. While wealthy plantation owners in Alabama's Black Belt and Tennessee's central regions accumulated enormous fortunes through slave labor and cotton exports, farmers in the proposed Nicerjack territory struggled to make ends meet on rocky soil that barely supported subsistence agriculture. They had no economic investment in preserving slavery because they had never been able to afford enslaved workers in the first place. The absence of slavery in these communities created political loyalties that aligned more closely with Union interests than Confederate ambitions. Under the Three-Fifths Compromise, plantation counties wielded disproportionate legislative power through their enslaved populations, allowing wealthy slaveholders to dominate state politics while ignoring the needs of non-slaveholding farmers. Nicerjack residents viewed the secession crisis through the lens of class conflict rather than regional pride, recognizing that wealthy slaveholders were pushing for war to protect economic privileges that mountain farmers had never shared. As southern states began seceding in late 1860 and early 1861, Nicerjack residents organized political resistance to their state's departure from the Union. They held public meetings where speakers denounced secession as a rich man's war that would be fought by poor men who had nothing to gain from preserving slavery. Communities passed resolutions declaring their continued loyalty to the United States government and rejecting their state government's authority to drag them into rebellion against federal authority. The Nicerjack independence movement gained momentum as Alabama and Tennessee formally joined the Confederacy. Residents recognized that remaining within their seceded states would subject them to Confederate military conscription and taxation to support a war they opposed. They began organizing a formal proposal to create a new Union state from the counties that had rejected secession, arguing that they deserved representation in a government that reflected their political loyalties and economic interests. But Nicerjack faced insurmountable political obstacles from the start. Alabama and Tennessee legislatures were dominated by slaveholder interests that viewed mountain unionism as a direct threat to Confederate political unity. These wealthy planters recognized that allowing counties to secede and form a Union state would create a dangerous precedent that could inspire similar movements in other areas where slavery was less economically important. They used their legislative majorities to block any consideration of Nicerjack's statehood proposals. Confederate authorities moved aggressively to suppress Nicerjack unionism before it could organize effective resistance. They imposed martial law in counties throughout the region, arrested prominent Union sympathizers, and began conscripting local men into Confederate military service regardless of their political loyalties. Anyone caught advocating for Union statehood faced charges of treason punishable by death. These harsh measures effectively crushed organized independence movements, while forcing many Nicerjack residents to choose between fleeing their homes or submitting to Confederate authority. Despite Confederate repression, many Nicerjack residents found ways to support the Union cause throughout the war. They provided intelligence to federal forces, served as guides for Union raids into Confederate territory, and frequently deserted from Confederate military units to join Union regiments. Some entire communities effectively withdrew their cooperation from Confederate authorities, creating pockets of passive resistance that persisted until federal forces occupied their territories. The areas that would have comprised Nicerjack now house over 2.1 million people across northern Alabama and eastern Tennessee. These populations maintain distinct political and cultural identities that trace back to their Civil War era unionism. Modern political patterns in these regions reflect the same independence that characterized the original Nicerjack movement, with residents often supporting candidates who emphasize economic populism and government accountability over traditional party loyalty. The economic challenges facing modern Nicerjack territory mirror some of the class-based concerns that originally drove the independence movement. These areas struggle with limited economic opportunities and political representation that residents often feel fails to address their specific regional needs. Alabama maintains a Cook partisan voting index of R+11, while Tennessee shows R+14, but these historical Nicerjack counties often vote differently from their state patterns. The political independence that drove Nicerjack residents to resist Confederate authority still characterizes these regions today. But while Nicerjack's grand statehood dreams collapsed under Confederate threats, sometimes the smallest acts of defiance proved surprisingly successful. Scott County, the tiny state that actually seceded and got away with it. Number 5. Scott County, first proposed in 1861. Scott County didn't just talk about independence, they declared it, lived it, and got away with it longer than any other American territory that attempted to break free from state authority. While dozens of proposed states failed to achieve independence despite years of political organizing and congressional lobbying, this tiny Tennessee county actually pulled off successful secession and maintained it for 125 years. The secret to Scott County's success wasn't superior political organization or powerful allies in Washington. It was their complete insignificance to everyone else. When Scott County declared independence on October 30, 1861, they represented fewer than 2,000 residents scattered across remote Appalachian mountains that most Tennessee politicians couldn't even locate on a map. The county generated minimal tax revenue, contributed nothing to state political power, and occupied territory that nobody else wanted to control or develop. Scott County's path to independence began with the same Civil War tensions that sparked the Nicerjack movement in neighboring regions. As Tennessee debated joining the Confederacy in early 1861, Scott County residents found themselves facing a political crisis that directly threatened their economic survival and personal safety. The county's mountainous terrain made slave-based agriculture impossible, so residents operated small family farms that had never depended on enslaved labor for their economic viability. When Tennessee voted to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy on June 8, 1861, Scott County residents faced an immediate dilemma. Confederate membership would subject them to military conscription in a war they opposed, taxation to support a government they rejected, and potential retaliation from Union forces who might view them as enemy combatants. The county's residents had no economic or political investment in preserving slavery, and they saw no reason to sacrifice their lives or property for wealthy plantation owners' interests. Scott County's response was swift and decisive. just over a month after Tennessee joined the Confederacy, Scott County residents held a public meeting and formally declared their independence from Tennessee. They proclaimed themselves the free and independent state of Scott, rejecting both Tennessee's Confederate allegiance and any obligation to support the Southern Rebellion. The declaration wasn't just symbolic political theater. Scott County residents meant to govern themselves as an independent political entity for as long as necessary. The declaration created an extraordinary situation where a county with fewer than 2,000 residents claimed the same political status as sovereign states like Virginia or Pennsylvania. Scott County established its own local government, maintained its own tax system, and operated its own courts without reference to Tennessee state authority. Residents pledged allegiance to their county government rather than the Confederate States of America, creating a pocket of Union loyalty deep within Confederate territory. Tennessee's response to Scott County's secession was remarkably passive. State officials essentially ignored the declaration and made no serious effort to reassert Tennessee's authority over the rebel county. This non-response wasn't based on respect for Scott County's political rights or sympathy for their Union loyalties. Tennessee politicians simply calculated that Scott County wasn't worth the military effort and political expense required to force them back into the state. The calculation made perfect sense from Tennessee's perspective. Scott County contributed almost nothing to state finances, held no strategic military value, and posed no threat to Confederate political unity elsewhere in the state. Sending troops to occupy a remote mountain county would waste military resources that Tennessee needed for defending against Union invasions along the Mississippi River and in Middle Tennessee. Scott County's rebellion was more of a minor administrative annoyance than a serious political crisis. Scott County's independence claims gained practical credibility through Tennessee's continued neglect over the following decades. After the Civil War ended and Tennessee rejoined the Union, state officials still showed no interest in reasserting formal control over Scott County. The county continued operating its own government, collecting its own taxes, and managing its own affairs without Tennessee interference or oversight. This de facto independence persisted through Reconstruction, the Progressive Era, the Great Depression, and World War II without any serious challenge from Tennessee state government. Scott County residents began referring to their territory as an independent state in official documents, tourist materials, and local government communications. By the 1950s, Scott County's independence claims had become a source of local pride and tourist curiosity rather than a political controversy. The independence finally ended in 1986 when Scott County officials formally requested to rejoin Tennessee after 125 years of separation. The decision wasn't driven by political pressure from Nashville or federal authorities. Instead, Scott County leaders recognized that formal reintegration with Tennessee would provide access to state funding for road improvements, educational programs, and economic development initiatives that their independent county government couldn't afford to provide. Tennessee welcomed Scott County back with surprising ceremony and celebration. Governor Lamar Alexander attended the formal reunion ceremony, and state officials treated the event as a historical milestone worth commemorating rather than a bureaucratic formality. Modern Scott County contains approximately 23,000 residents, showing how this unique 125-year experiment in de facto statehood proved that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance achieve the most lasting success. But while Scott County succeeded through obscurity, other regions tried to honor America's most famous president and discovered that presidential names carried their own political complications. Lincoln, the presidential state that never honored the 16th president. Number 4. Lincoln, first proposed in 1845. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, preserved the Union, and became one of America's most revered presidents. Yet despite multiple serious attempts across different regions and time periods, no state has ever successfully adopted his name. The repeated failures to create a state of Lincoln represent one of the most puzzling ironies in American political geography, a beloved president whose name couldn't overcome the practical politics of statehood admission. The first Lincoln proposal emerged during the complex negotiations surrounding Texas statehood in 1845-46. When Texas joined the United States, the annexation agreement included provisions allowing the massive territory to divide into as many as 5 separate states. The original Republic of Texas encompassed roughly twice the area of modern Texas, creating obvious administrative challenges for effective governance and political representation. Congressional negotiators exploring various division schemes proposed creating a state of Lincoln from Texas territory south and west of the Colorado River. This Lincoln would have included much of what is now central and southern Texas, encompassing major river valleys and fertile agricultural lands that seemed promising for future development. The proposal gained initial consideration from Texas political leaders who recognized that strategic territorial division could maximize their state's long-term political influence in Congress. But the Texas Lincoln proposal collapsed under the weight of slavery politics and competing territorial interests. Southern politicians worried that creating multiple states from Texas territory would dilute slaveholder political power rather than strengthening it as intended. Northern representatives opposed any arrangement that might create additional slave states and tip the delicate sectional balance that had been maintained through previous compromises. The proposal died in committee discussions before reaching formal congressional consideration. A more serious Lincoln statehood movement developed in the Pacific Northwest during the territorial organization period of the 1860s. When Congress created Washington Territory, Idaho Territory, and Montana Territory in 1864, residents of the region that would become the Idaho Panhandle found themselves in an impossible political situation. The area was geographically isolated from the rest of Idaho Territory by mountain ranges that made communication and transportation extremely difficult. Panhandle residents felt politically abandoned by territorial governments located hundreds of miles away across dangerous mountain passes. They couldn't participate effectively in territorial politics, receive adequate government services, or influence territorial policies that affected their daily lives. The isolation created practical governance problems that seemed to require either territorial boundary changes or complete independence through separate statehood. Local leaders organized a petition drive in 1864-65 calling for creation of a state of Lincoln from the Idaho Panhandle region, arguing that their territory met all standard requirements for statehood admission. They had sufficient population for political representation, established local government institutions, and economic activities that could support state-level taxation and administration. The Lincoln proposal seemed to offer a logical solution to the geographic and political problems created by existing territorial boundaries. Congress rejected the Pacific Northwest Lincoln proposal without holding hearings, reflecting federal priorities that emphasized territorial consolidation rather than fragmentation. Federal authorities preferred creating larger, more economically viable states rather than accommodating regional preferences for smaller political units. The rejection left Panhandle residents stuck with territorial governments they couldn't effectively participate in or influence. The most ambitious Lincoln proposal emerged in the early 20th century as Western territories prepared for statehood admission. This version would have combined eastern Washington, northern Idaho, and western Montana into a single state extending from the Pacific Northwest to the Continental Divide. Proponents argued that these regions shared common economic interests in mining, logging, and agriculture that distinguished them from the more urbanized areas of their respective territories. The early 1900s Lincoln movement gained substantial local support through organized political campaigns that emphasized regional economic development and improved political representation. Supporters held conventions, elected provisional representatives, and submitted formal petitions to Congress requesting Lincoln statehood consideration. The movement attracted newspaper coverage and political attention, that suggested serious federal consideration was possible. Federal authorities again rejected the Lincoln proposal, preferring to admit Washington, Idaho, and Montana as separate states with their existing territorial boundaries. Congressional leaders calculated that 3 states would provide more reliable political support for federal policies than one large western state with potentially unpredictable political loyalties. The decision reflected standard federal preferences for political predictability over regional convenience. The repeated appearance of Lincoln's name in statehood movements across different regions and time periods reveals the symbolic power his presidency held for Americans seeking political independence and democratic representation. Lincoln represented principled leadership, democratic values, and government responsiveness to citizen needs, exactly the qualities that frustrated residents felt their distant territorial and state governments lacked. Lincoln's association with preserving the Union also made his name politically appealing for regions that wanted to emphasize their loyalty to federal authority while seeking independence from state governments they viewed as unresponsive or hostile. Using Lincoln's name signaled patriotic motivations rather than separatist rebellion, potentially making statehood proposals more acceptable to federal authorities. But while Lincoln's name carried presidential dignity, some regions chose names that reflected a very different kind of attitude toward their political situation. Superior, Michigan's Upper Peninsula still thinks it's better. Number 3, Superior, first proposed in 1897. The name Superior carries a double meaning that perfectly captures the attitude of Michigan's Upper Peninsula residents toward their downstate neighbors. Geographically, Superior refers to Lake Superior, the massive body of water that dominates the region's northern border. But locals have never been shy about suggesting the name also reflects their moral and cultural superiority over the crowded cities and industrial complexes of southern Michigan. Michigan's bizarre two-peninsula geography creates one of the most unusual state configurations in America. The Upper Peninsula and Lower Peninsula are separated by the Straits of Mackinac, a 5-mile stretch of water that creates a genuine geographic barrier between the two regions. Before the Mackinac Bridge opened in 1957, traveling between the peninsulas required ferry service that could be disrupted by weather, ice, or mechanical problems. This physical separation fostered distinct regional identities that persist long after modern transportation eliminated the practical barriers. The Upper Peninsula's isolation bred a fiercely independent culture that viewed downstate Michigan with suspicion and resentment. Yupas, as Upper Peninsula residents call themselves, developed their own dialect, cultural traditions, and economic priorities that had little in common with Detroit's automobile industry or Grand Rapids' manufacturing base. The Upper Peninsula economy centered on mining, logging, and tourism rather than the heavy industry that dominated southern Michigan. The first formal superior statehood proposal emerged in 1897 when Upper Peninsula advocates proposed combining northern Michigan with northern Wisconsin to create a new state that would span both sides of Lake Superior. The proposal made geographic and economic sense because these regions shared similar terrain, climate, and natural resource-based economies. Northern Wisconsin residents faced many of the same challenges as Upper Peninsula Yupas: political domination by southern urban areas, economic neglect, and cultural alienation from their state capitals. The 1897 proposal gained initial support from residents on both sides of the state border, but it never developed the political momentum needed to force serious congressional consideration. Frustrated Yupas found creative ways to challenge Michigan's authority over their region throughout the 20th century. In 1959, a Michigan resident named Ted Albert filed a divorce lawsuit seeking to legally separate the two peninsulas through court action rather than legislative petition. Albert's colorful legal strategy attracted national media attention for its novelty, but Michigan courts rejected his arguments and ruled that state territorial boundaries could only be changed through constitutional processes involving legislative action and federal approval. The Superior movement reached its organizational peak in 1962, when activists formed the Upper Peninsula Independence Association to advocate for formal statehood. The association collected signatures for a secession petition that eventually gathered 20,000 names supporting Upper Peninsula independence. The petition represented a significant portion of the Upper Peninsula's adult population and demonstrated substantial grassroots support for separation from Michigan. But the association discovered that collecting signatures was easier than forcing political action. Michigan law required 56,000 signatures to place a secession referendum on the state ballot, and the association fell well short of that threshold despite months of organizing effort. Without a ballot referendum, the petition had no legal force and served only as a symbolic gesture of Upper Peninsula frustration. This legal requirement effectively killed the Superior movement's most serious attempt at achieving independence through democratic processes. Superior statehood discussions revived in the 1970s when economic and environmental pressures created new sources of conflict between the Upper Peninsula and southern Michigan. The movement gained additional momentum through collaboration with northern Wisconsin residents who faced similar tensions with their state government in Madison. The two regions explored joint statehood as a way to combine their political influence and create a state government that would prioritize rural interests over urban concerns. Environmental legislation became a particular source of resentment during the 1970s, as both Michigan and Wisconsin passed laws restricting industrial activities in northern regions. Upers and northern Wisconsin residents viewed these regulations as economic warfare designed to preserve wilderness areas for urban tourists while destroying the livelihoods of rural families who depended on natural resource extraction for employment. Recent discussions about Michigan tax law revisions have revived superior statehood talk among some Upper Peninsula residents who feel their region continues receiving inadequate attention from Lansing politicians. The Upper Peninsula houses approximately 300,000 residents scattered across 16,000 square miles of largely rural territory, giving Upers minimal political influence in statewide elections and legislative decisions. The Upper identity remains strong in 2025, reflecting the same rural-urban tensions that have driven superior movements for over a century. But while Michigan's Upper Peninsula residents chose a name that proclaimed their superiority, some statehood movements emerged from communities that faced far more fundamental questions about their place in American society. Sequia, the Native American state that Congress refused to consider. Number 2. Sequia, first proposed in 1905. The proposed state of Sequia stands apart from every other failed statehood movement in American history for one crucial reason. It would have been a state by Native Americans, for Native Americans, governed according to indigenous political traditions while operating within the American constitutional framework. No other statehood proposal attempted to create a political entity where Native American tribes would exercise primary governmental authority over their ancestral territories. The Sequia movement emerged from a devastating assault on tribal sovereignty that fundamentally altered the relationship between Native American nations and the federal government. The Curtis Act of 1898 dismantled tribal governments and forced federal agents to oversee land allotment, effectively ending much of the sovereignty Native communities in the territory once held. Before this federal legislation, the 5 civilized tribes Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole had maintained their own governmental institutions, court systems, and territorial boundaries within Indian territory. The federal legislation used forced assimilation as its primary weapon against tribal political independence. Congress justified the Curtis Act by claiming that tribal governments prevented Native Americans from becoming productive American citizens who could contribute to national economic development. Federal authorities argued that communal land ownership and tribal political structures represented primitive social arrangements that kept Native Americans economically backward and politically isolated from mainstream American society. Tribal leaders recognized the Curtis Act as an existential threat to their people's cultural survival and political independence. They understood that federal assimilation policies aimed to eliminate tribal identity entirely by forcing Native Americans to abandon their political institutions, cultural practices, and communal economic systems. The choice facing tribal leaders was stark: submit to federal assimilation policies or find alternative strategies for preserving tribal autonomy within the American political system. Leaders from the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes chose resistance through political innovation. In 1905, they organized a constitutional convention in Muskogee that brought together representatives from all 5 tribes to explore creating an indigenous-controlled state that could protect tribal interests while operating within American governmental structures. The convention represented unprecedented cooperation among tribes that had historically maintained separate political relationships with federal authorities. The Constitutional Convention produced a remarkable document that blended American democratic principles with indigenous political traditions and values. Tribal representatives drafted a constitution and Bill of Rights for the proposed state of Sequia that would have been governed by indigenous leaders and structured like any other U.S. state. The Constitution guaranteed individual civil rights while protecting communal tribal property ownership and cultural practices that federal assimilation policies sought to eliminate. The proposed Sequia Constitution included progressive provisions that exceeded the civil rights protections found in most existing state constitutions. The document guaranteed freedom of religion, speech, and assembly while explicitly protecting Native American cultural practices and tribal ceremonial activities. The Constitution prohibited discrimination based on tribal membership or indigenous heritage, creating legal protections for Native Americans that didn't exist in surrounding states. The Sequia Constitution also addressed practical governance questions about how tribal political traditions could function within American federal structures. The document created a bicameral legislature with representation based on both geographic districts and tribal membership, ensuring that all 5 tribes would maintain political influence regardless of population changes. The Constitution established an independent judiciary, with judges selected through tribal consultation processes rather than partisan political elections. Tribal representatives submitted their Sequia statehood petition to Congress with confidence that their proposal met all standard requirements for admission to the Union. The proposed state encompassed a territory larger than many existing states, contained sufficient population to justify congressional representation, and demonstrated the organized governmental structures that federal authorities required for statehood consideration. The 5 tribes had proven their capacity for effective self-governance through decades of successful tribal administration before the Curtis Act disrupted their political institutions. Congress rejected the Sequia proposal without holding hearings or committee discussions about Native American statehood. Federal authorities dismissed the petition as incompatible with American political principles and federal assimilation policies. Congressional leaders made clear that they would never permit Native Americans to control state-level governmental authority over any American territory, regardless of their legal qualifications or political capabilities. Instead of Sequia, Congress created Oklahoma in 1907 by combining Indian Territory with Oklahoma Territory to form a single state under non-native political control. This decision ensured that Native Americans would constitute a minority population within the new state and would never be able to exercise the political influence they would have wielded in Sequia. The 5 tribes were merged into this new arrangement, completing the federal destruction of tribal sovereignty that the Curtis Act had begun nearly a decade earlier. Contemporary tribal sovereignty in Oklahoma demonstrates remarkable recovery from the political destruction that prompted the original Sequia movement. Modern tribal nations have regained substantial governmental authority through federal court victories and successful economic development that has restored tribal political influence. While Sequia failed, the tribes achieved something federal authorities never expected possible after such systematic attempts to eliminate their political independence. But while Sequia's leaders pursued statehood through formal constitutional processes and congressional petitions, some independence movements chose completely unconventional approaches that ignored traditional political channels entirely. Absuroka, the passive-aggressive state with beauty pageants and license plates. Number 1. Absuroka, first proposed in 1935. A.R. Seceded had a different vision for achieving statehood. Rather than organizing formal political committees or drafting constitutional documents, Seceded simply declared himself the governor of Absuroka and began acting as if the proposed state already existed. He established a provisional government headquarters, appointed cabinet members, and started issuing official proclamations on behalf of the non-existent state. The Absuroka movement emerged from the grinding frustration of residents scattered across northern Wyoming, southern Montana, and western South Dakota during the depths of the Great Depression. These sparsely populated rural areas felt completely abandoned by their respective state governments, which seemed exclusively focused on supporting larger cities and more populous regions. Residents watched their tax dollars flow to urban areas, while their own communities struggled with failing roads, inadequate schools, and non-existent government services. The geographic isolation that defined Absuroka territory made residents feel like forgotten citizens in their own states. Northern Wyoming residents had to travel hundreds of miles to reach Cheyenne for state business, crossing empty rangeland and mountain passes that could become impassable during winter storms. Southern Montana communities were equally distant from Helena, separated by vast expanses of prairie and high desert. Western South Dakota felt politically disconnected from Pierre, despite technically being closer to the state capital than their counterparts in Wyoming and Montana. This physical isolation created a shared identity among residents who had more in common with each other than with their respective state governments. They all dealt with similar challenges: harsh weather, limited economic opportunities, poor transportation infrastructure, and the constant struggle of maintaining rural communities in an increasingly urbanized nation. These shared experiences across state lines laid the foundation for a movement that transcended traditional political boundaries. Seceded understood that traditional political organizing would never work for a region with such a small, scattered population. Instead of trying to compete with established political parties and government bureaucracies, he turned Absuroka statehood into a form of performance art that attracted media attention and public curiosity. His theatrical approach transformed a legitimate political grievance into an entertaining spectacle that people could enjoy while still taking the underlying issues seriously. The movement's most famous innovation was the creation of official Absuroka license plates that residents could display on their vehicles instead of their regular state plates, beginning in 1939. These unauthorized license plates became symbols of regional identity and political rebellion that allowed supporters to publicly demonstrate their allegiance to the independence movement. The plates featured distinctive designs that emphasized the region's Western heritage and natural beauty, while rejecting the political authority of Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota. The license plate campaign created practical legal complications for residents who chose to participate. State motor vehicle departments had no authority to recognize Absuroka plates, meaning drivers risked traffic citations and legal problems if they removed their official state plates. But many residents decided the symbolic value of displaying Absuroka plates outweighed the potential legal consequences, creating a form of civil disobedience that highlighted their frustration with existing state governments. The Miss Absuroka beauty pageant represented the movement's most creative publicity strategy. Organized in 1939, the pageant brought together young women from across the proposed territory to compete for the title of Miss Absuroka, complete with formal ceremonies, judges, and prize presentations. The event generated newspaper coverage and radio attention that spread awareness of the independence movement far beyond the rural communities where it originated. The beauty pageant served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. It created a sense of shared identity among residents of different states who rarely had opportunities to interact with each other. The pageant also demonstrated that Absuroka supporters could organize successful events and maintain cultural institutions, suggesting they had the social cohesion necessary for effective self-governance. Most importantly, the pageant attracted media coverage that treated Absuroka as a legitimate political entity rather than a fringe movement. Seceded and his supporters established other unofficial state institutions designed to reinforce Absuroka's claims to legitimacy. They created a state seal, composed an official anthem, and designated a state capital in the small Wyoming town of Sheridan. These symbolic gestures had no legal authority, but they helped build a sense of shared identity among residents who had never thought of themselves as belonging to a single political community. The movement gained surprising momentum throughout the late 1930s as media coverage attracted supporters from across the region and beyond. Residents began referring to themselves as Absurokans and organizing social events that brought together people from different states who shared similar frustrations with their respective governments. The movement developed an almost carnival-like atmosphere that combined serious political grievances with humor and regional pride. But World War II effectively killed the Absuroka movement as national priorities shifted dramatically toward wartime unity and production. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 created a patriotic atmosphere that made regional secession movements seem unpatriotic and divisive. Residents who had supported Absuroka independence redirected their energy towards supporting the war effort and demonstrating their loyalty to the United States. From Transylvania's colonial ambitions to Absuroka's theatrical rebellion, these 12 movements represent far more than historical curiosities about American political development. The common thread connecting these movements reveals two powerful forces that shaped American political development. Geographic isolation consistently drove independence movements, from Transylvania's mountain barriers to Delm Marva's water separation to Absuroka's prairie distances. But equally striking is how many came tantalizingly close to success. Franklin lost by just 2 votes, while Sequia met every federal requirement yet faced immediate rejection. These patterns persist today. 13 Oregon counties have voted to join Idaho in the Greater Idaho Movement, while the Texas nationalist movement gained enough support to earn inclusion in the 2024 Republican Party platform. The same geographic and political tensions that sparked historical movements continue driving modern independence campaigns. Which of these 12 stories surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below.